One aspect of my builds which gets the least attention is the basing. While I'll always take the time to cover how I tackle these integral parts of my miniatures, I am always somewhat limited by the fact that I always build my minis to be gaming pieces. Base size and model height has to be somewhat controlled when line of sight is drawn to the visible parts of a model, and so how large or elaborate you can make your base is somewhat stifled. But not if you're building and painting miniatures purely for display purposes. Here, the sky's the limit, and in this video I'll be remedying its sparseness on my channel by showing you how to build a scenic, industrial-inspired base. And to help me demonstrate these techniques, I'll be building a base for this veteran Kazakh mini from Corvus Belli's Infinity range, who are also the sponsors of this video. As you can see, after I'd finished prepping the miniature, I kept it separate from its base, which would just make painting both easier. However, to make sure I still had a way to hold onto it, I first drilled a 1mm hole into the bottom of its right foot and superglued a length of 1mm wire into it. For now, this wire was inserted into the cork of my painting handle, but this wire would play another important role later on. But for now, my focus returned to the base and how I planned to build it. For this kind of work, I often like to create a rough sketch of how things will look. When building a scenic base, you have far more freedom than when you're kitbashing a miniature, so I like to give myself some guidelines to work towards. It doesn't have to be pretty or particularly detailed, just enough to provide a definitive endpoint. Now, as I mentioned earlier, by not having to worry about using this miniature for gaming, I could immediately ditch the supplied 25mm base and instead opt for a larger 32mm base that would provide me with some much needed room. Armed with this base, I then used it to tackle my next problem, substance. When you're building a scenic base, you will need something to bulk out your base in order to create the desired scene. The material you use doesn't matter too much, but it should be both structurally sturdy and easy enough to work with. High density foam is great for this, but I settled on my trusty cork floor tiles, mainly because I bought a pack of these 7 years ago and I still have tons left. Using my new base, I marked out 3 discs before cutting them out with my scissors. 2 of these discs were then cut in half to create a whole disc and 4 halves. The full disc would sit at the bottom and form the lowest level of ground, while the halves would be stacked to create some elevation. But before I could glue these discs together, I first tore up the edge of the bottom disc to create a little irregularity in the earthen surface. Once I was happy with the damage, I superglued this to a 32mm base before then also stacking and gluing the halves on top. Once the glue had dried and the discs were firmly stacked together, I used an emery board to sand flat the vertical piece of cork that would sit behind my wall. In addition to this, I also used the board to smooth out the back of the discs. With this being a display piece, I didn't worry too much about how the back of the base looked, but having a smoother, more rounded surface would look better. For the bricks that would build up the wall, I'd actually already created these a while ago. Whenever I've mixed up a little too much milliput, I roll out my excess to create a roughly 2mm thickness before then allowing it to partly cure for a few hours. Once it's slightly firmer, I cut the putty into narrow strips of roughly 3mm width, which are then further cut down into 5mm chunks, although some variations in size can be quite useful. From here, the bricks are left to dry fully overnight, at which point I was able to rough up the edges a little with my knife before gluing a single row of bricks at the bottom of the wall, leaving a small gap between each brick and the bottom of the cork. To create the section of pipe that would be jutting out from the wall, I simply used a piece of plasticard pipe. After cutting it down to the desired length, this was also superglued to the wall and the remaining bricks were added. I did have to cut a couple in half to fit around the pipe and towards the edges, but don't worry if things aren't perfectly aligned. It simply adds to a worn, slightly dilapidated appearance. By leaving gaps between the bricks, I was now able to add the mortar. I created this by painting some texture paste directly into the gaps. After filling in a few of the gaps, I cleaned away some of the spillover with a slightly damp paper towel, leaving me with the effect of mortar between the bricks. After repeating this process across the whole wall, I allowed the paste to fully dry. With the bricks complete, I was now able to add a few more details to the base. To create the appearance of a small pipe or conduit, I used some 1mm plastic rod. To secure the pipe, a couple of holes were drilled into the base and into the brick wall. Into one of the holes, I inserted a straight piece of vertical pipe and clipped it to the height of the wall, securing it into place with more superglue. For the second pipe, I created a 90-degree angle that ran horizontally across the wall before disappearing into it. To finish off the base, I decided to add one of my obligatory dead animal bits by taking the small femur from my plastic kit and gluing it to the bottom disc of the base. And with that, I was ready to start painting. As the base would feature a lot of earthy tones, it made the most sense to kick things off with a brown primer, specifically some Hyrax brown spray paint from the Color Forge. With the primer in place, my first area of focus was the brick, and I decided to approach this with some dry brushing. This is not only a quick way to apply the paint, but it's also a great way to pick out the texture of the brick. I began this process by laying out a little boar hide and fur cloak from the Tooth & Coats range onto my dry palette. I ever so slightly dampened my brush and worked a small amount of boar hide through the bristles. This was then applied using some quick and light motions across the bricks where it caused the paint to form more onto the upper segments of the wall. This effect was pushed even further as I added some fur cloak into my brush. This brighter reddish orange was applied a little more lightly than before and was focused more towards the upper third of the wall, creating a gradient from dark to light. Finally, some of the bright orange of rust orange was very gently applied to just the hard edges of the bricks. Here the paint accumulated to form a thin line of paint that helped to further emphasize the details. With the bricks complete, my focus turned towards the mortar in between them. I first began with some thinned wizard grey to carefully pick out the textured filling between the bricks. This was then continued with a little of the lighter Carcharodon grey. For this step, I applied the paint a little more sporadically, resulting in a less consistent colour, but an overall more realistic appearance. Leaving the brickwork alone for the time being, I would next tackle the metal pipe and conduit using some of this dirty down rust. I've used this in previous videos and it's an excellent way of quickly creating that oxidized effect. This was applied straight from the pot across the metal parts. As the dirty down dries, the rust effect begins to form, resulting in this incredibly realistic appearance. Over the top of this, I then applied some rough scratches of metal using some plate armor, before applying more dirty down rust over the top. This application was a little thinner though, and when combined with the previous metal coat, it helped to add some brighter orange patches of rust to contrast against the darker browns around it. Armed with another dirty down product, I next wanted to create some moss effects across the brickwork. Like with the rust, this paint can be applied straight from the pot, and I find it works best if built up in small patches. As it dries, a slightly lighter green mottled texture appears, mimicking how moss grows on surfaces. I focus the bulk of this application towards the bottom of the wall and beneath the pipe, areas where I'd expect moisture to accumulate. To paint the small femur attached to the base, I began with a base coat of Dragon Fang, before darkening the recesses with the use of some Battle Mud Wash. From here, I then finished it off with an initial highlight of Skeleton Legion, and then finally some Ivory Tusk. At this point in the build, I began painting my veteran Kazakh, where I opted for a combination of a bright yellow armor alongside some darker, cool grey fatigues, both of which contrasted nicely against the drab tones that I'd applied to the base. Now this is something that often goes overlooked with bases. In addition to assisting in conveying a narrative or setting, picking a colour scheme that complements your miniature can really help to emphasize certain colours. On a very basic level, a dark miniature would look more impactful against a desert or snowy base, whereas a lighter, brighter miniature would be emphasized when placed on a dark earth or volcanic rock. You can even break out the old colour wheel and match up your purple miniatures with a lush tropical base, or your red miniatures with the icy blue of a frozen lake. So next time you're picking a scheme, play around with a few different colours and see what works best for your minis. Once my Kazakh was painted, I carefully removed him and his wire from the holder before trimming down the wire to a more manageable couple of centimeters. I then compared the model against the base and lightly pressed the wire into the soft cork, creating a small indentation. Using my pin vise once more, I drilled another hole through the cork before supergluing the wire and miniature to it. The end result was a much sturdier bond that would help keep the miniature locked into place. With the model in place, I could fill in the base with some more texture paste. specifically some AK Interactive's Wet Ground. This dries with a gloss finish that results in the appearance of wet mud. This was painted onto both the upper and lower parts of the base, where I carefully painted it around the feet and the bone. By adding the paste last, it helped to create the effect that the feet and the bone had slightly sunk in to the soggy ground. Once the mud had dried, I finished it off with a few more spots of dirty down moss. My next task was to add a little extra detail to that pipe by creating the effect of water rushing out of it. To create this water effect, I first wrapped a length of monofilament wire between two bottles to hold it taut. The wire created some support for my Yoo-hoo glue, which I applied across the wire. As long as you don't apply too much in one go, it should stick quite nicely to the wire. After leaving it dry, I then went over the top with another layer to bulk things out. Once dry, I cut the wire into smaller lengths, leaving me with some clear, flexible strips that could be inserted and glued into the pipe and to the base itself. After attaching 3 strips, I was left with the effect of churned water flowing through the pipe, which meant that all I had to do was to add some foliage. For this, I used some of the SCENIC range, specifically some Enchanted Realm and Verdant Meadow moss, along with some scorched vanilla grass. These were placed across the mud with the assistance of a little more superglue. The various shades of green in the moss pads, the dirty down moss and the grass tufts resulted in a much more natural looking effect. And with that, I was left with this. And so, that concludes this guide on building an industrial-inspired scenic base. Now with this particular theme, it can be relevant to many different time periods. Simply remove the conduit and it would work great for as early as the 18th century up to distant sci-fi futures. I could easily see the veteran Kazakh being swapped out with a Napoleonic rifleman or a member of the 3rd Infantry Division in Khan. Now as this model spins, you may notice that the back side of the base is a little featureless, which isn't really a problem. As I mentioned, it's intended to sit in a display cabinet where you're not likely to see the back anyway. But if you did want to have a cleaner look, you could always repurpose the plastic card finish that I applied to my Knight Titan build, which I'll link to below. Speaking of the links below, you can find all the paints and materials that I used listed there too, as well as some links to the fantastic looking miniatures of the Infinity range. As I mentioned earlier, I just want to say a big thank you to Corvus Belli for sponsoring this video and for providing me with the veteran Kazakh miniature. But before I go, let me just say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep this channel going, and if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Adrian Ruiz, Ban Yevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, George Kanzini Roberts, Hobby Bobby, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Older Than Time, Sam Sepulveda, Swedsman, Tim, and One Novice. And my top channel members who are Alex Verne, Bon Johnson, Dave, Doug H, Lee Ely, Mark Taylor, Miso Pogon, Nerdington Paints, Omnitom, Philip Poyer, S.O., Satoran, S.J. Carper, Stefan Van Dalen, That One Tech Priest, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.